Rescissible and voidable contracts. Badges of fraud. Defective contracts. Ratification. Annulment. Defective contracts. Defective contracts are agreements that have legal flaws or problems affecting their validity or enforceability. Corrected, these contracts are not completely invalid at the beginning, but they may be rescinded, annulled, or depending on the defect present. Types of defective contracts. Rescissible contracts. Voidable contracts. Unenforceable contracts. Void contracts. Types of defective contracts. Under the law, defective contracts are generally classified into several categories depending on the nature of the defect present in the agreement. These types include rescissible contracts, contracts that are valid but may be cancelled because they cause damage or prejudice to one of the parties or to third persons. Voidable contracts, contracts that are valid and binding but may be annulled because of defects in consent or lack of legal capacity. Unenforceable contracts, contracts that cannot be enforced in court unless they are ratified or confirmed. Void contracts, contracts that are completely without legal effect because they violate the law or public policy. Each type of defective contract has its own legal consequences and remedies. Rescissible contracts. Rescissible contracts are agreements that are valid and effective at the time they are formed, but they result in damage, prejudice, or economic loss to one of the parties or to a third person. Because of this harmful effect, the law allows the contract to be rescinded or set aside through a proper legal action. The purpose of rescission is to restore fairness and protect the interests of the injured party. Rescission does not mean that the contract was invalid from the beginning. Instead, it recognizes that the contract was valid but produced unfair consequences that must be corrected by the court. Characteristics of rescissible contracts. Rescissible contracts have several important characteristics that distinguish them from other defective contracts. First, they are valid and legally binding at the time they are created. The parties have given their consent and the essential elements of a contract are present. Second, the defect arises not from the formation of the contract but from the damage or prejudice caused by the agreement. Third, the contract may be rescinded through a legal action filed by the injured party in order to repair the harm caused. Lastly, rescission aims to restore the parties to their original condition before the contract was made. Voidable contracts. Voidable contracts are contracts that are valid and enforceable from the moment they are entered into, but they contain a defect that affects the consent of the parties or the legal capacity of one of them. Because of this defect, the contract may be annulled or cancelled by the party who is legally entitled to question it. However, until it is annulled, the contract remains valid and produces legal effects. Voidable contracts recognize that although an agreement was formed, the presence of a defect may have affected the freedom, awareness, or legal ability of a party to give proper consent. Badges of fraud. Badges of fraud are indicators or circumstances that suggest the possible presence of fraud in a transaction. Fraud often involves the intention to deceive or mislead another person, and it can be difficult to prove directly. Because of this, the law recognizes certain conditions or suspicious circumstances that may indicate fraudulent intent. These indicators help courts determine whether a transaction was made in good faith or with the intention of avoiding legal obligations or harming another party. When several badges of fraud appear in a transaction, they may serve as evidence that the agreement was made dishonestly or with fraudulent intent. Nature of voidable contracts. Voidable contracts possess several important characteristics that define their legal nature. They are considered binding and effective unless annulled by a competent court. This means the contract continues to exist and produces legal obligations until the injured party seeks annulment. The defect usually involves issues related to consent, such as mistake, fraud, intimidation, or undue influence, or situations where one of the parties does not have full legal capacity. Despite these defects, the law also allows voidable contracts to be ratified, which means the defect may be corrected and the contract may become fully valid. Badges of fraud. Badges of fraud refer to circumstances, conditions, or indicators that suggest the possible presence of fraudulent intent in a transaction. Fraud is often difficult to prove directly because it involves the intent to deceive or mislead another person. Because of this, courts rely on these indicators to determine whether fraud may have occurred. Badges of fraud do not automatically prove that fraud exists. Instead, they raise suspicion and provide evidence that may support a claim of fraudulent activity. When several badges of fraud are present in a transaction, it may indicate that the agreement was made to avoid legal obligations or to deceive another party. Badges of fraud. Badges of fraud are indicators or circumstances that suggest the possible presence of fraud in a transaction. Fraud often involves the intention to deceive or mislead another person, and it can be difficult to prove directly. Because of this, the law recognizes certain conditions or suspicious circumstances that may indicate fraudulent intent. These indicators help courts determine whether a transaction was made in good faith or with the intention of avoiding legal obligations or harming another party. When several badges of fraud appear in a transaction, they may serve as evidence that the agreement was made dishonestly or with fraudulent intent. Ratification and annulment. Ratification is the act of confirming or approving a voidable contract by the party who has the legal right to question it. When a contract is ratified, the defect affecting the agreement is corrected, and the contract becomes fully valid and enforceable. The right to annul the contract is also removed. On the other hand, annulment is a legal remedy used to cancel a voidable contract because of a defect in consent or legal capacity. When annulment is granted, the contract's legal effects are removed, and the parties are generally restored to their original situation before the contract was made.